We're living in confusing times. Too often we don't know where to turn for clarity. With the Ruthless Compassion podcast, we strive to give you content that's authentic, uplifting, and inspiring. We're sharing leading-edge ideas and offering practical tools for change. We're talking to passionate, creative individuals who will challenge your assumptions and help you to see things from a fresh perspective. Everybody has a story to tell, and this platform will bring you some of the best. Welcome to the Ruthless Compassion podcast. Elinor Greenberg, PhD, is a psychologist and internationally renowned Gestalt Therapy trainer who specializes in teaching the diagnosis and treatment of borderline, narcissistic, and schizoid adaptations in a lively and practical way. She is a faculty member of the New York Institute for Gestalt Therapy, the Gestalt Center for Psychotherapy and Training, and a former faculty member of the Masterson Institute, as well as an associate editor of the peer-reviewed journal Gestalt Review. Dr. Greenberg is the author of Borderline, Narcissistic, and Schizoid Adaptations, The Pursuit of Love, Admiration, and Safety. Welcome, Elinor Greenberg, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Marcia.
First of all, I just wanted you to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and maybe even why you do it.
Okay. I'm a licensed psychologist in New York City, a Gestalt therapist, and I work with borderline, narcissistic, and schizoid adaptations, among other people who do not have personality disorders. And I retrained entirely in another form of therapy because as a Gestalt therapist, we didn't believe in diagnosing. And in my first year of being a Gestalt therapist, I realized I was seeing patterns in my clients who were quitting therapy. And one day they would love me, and then the next week they would quit because I was terrible. And I knew that I didn't have the answers. So I went on a journey of about 3 to 5 years to find people who could tell me what was going on. And then I studied for 10 years at the Masterson Institute and went on faculty. And all that time I was bringing back the information translated into everyday English from my Gestalt therapy colleagues. So I ended up training Gestalt therapists and other people in an easy to understand way to diagnose and treat personality disorders. And right now, narcissism seems to be front and center in the world. So I get the most questions about that, but I actually think schizoid adaptations would be the next big thing.
Well, maybe you can share with the listeners what these adaptations are about, distinguish one from the other.
Okay, well, I'm going to do it in the simplest way possible. And the listeners, and you, if you like, can go along and ask yourself this question. If you had to choose in an interpersonal relationship that was going to be intimate and serious, which of these do you need? First, second, and third. Love. By love, I mean nurturing, warm feelings, the conviction that this person loves you through thick and thin, will take care of you. Or admiration. And by admiration, I mean all the things like respect, someone idealizing you, putting you on a pedestal, seeing all the things that you do and appreciating your achievements. And the other is safety, interpersonal safety, feeling like you have your own space, that they won't intrude on you, that they're not going to seek to dominate you or suck up all the air in the room. So we have these three things, shorthand: love, admiration, or safety. Which one do you have to have? And what order would they be? Naturally, everybody wants everything. But one of these will be so primary that it will feel like the solution to your love problems. If I only get this, then I'll be happy. Do you want to take a try at it, Marcia, or should I just let the audience do it?
I think you better let the audience do it.
So now, you don't have to have a personality disorder to do this, but it helps to understand your own preferences, because if you think of it times 1,000, then you have a personality disorder. So for me, love comes first. Interpersonal safety and idealization comes second, and I don't know which. I'd probably put love, interpersonal safety, and admiration third. So for me, with a borderline person, they would put love first. If I ask them what's the solution to their life problems, they'd say unconditional love, finding my soulmate, having somebody do all the hard parts of life for me that adults do because inside I feel like a child. Okay? If I ask a narcissist who's honest, they don't even see the point of the love. They've given up on love sometime early in childhood and separated and instead substituted achievement. So they are out there looking to be idealized, the center of admiring. They want to be the best. In their mind, there's a status hierarchy, and the only way to feel good about yourself is to be at the top of it or close to people who are at the top. So I represent the love people on my book. I have a red heart. For the achievement-oriented narcissist, I have a gold star for the exhibitionists, and in my mind, a silver star for the people who are in the shadows but want to be an exhibitionist. Then the safety-oriented people, I have an antique key. You can lock them out of your apartment. You can lock them out of your heart. You can keep a safe distance. So in this way, I'm defining people who foreground for them, despite signals that they might not be wanted, despite signals that this could be the wrong person, despite signals that this person is dangerous to them, they will still choose to love them if they're not too injured, if they have a borderline adaptation. So that will be your friend who's always getting her heart broken, and who doesn't choose wisely. Or it could be at the lower functioning end, the people, and they're afraid of abandonment or engulfment by the needs of others. So they might be corresponding with that serial killer in prison. They're the people who marry prisoners because that person's not going to leave them.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's at one end of it. That's at the borderline spectrum. High functioning is persons really good at work, creative, things like that. But inside feels like they're in one of these 60s movies where a 13-year-old is suddenly put into an adult body. And that's how people with borderline go along. So in the narcissistic one, we have people who in their intimate relationships can't cut it. They just don't know how to have one. They know how to strive. They know how to achieve, or they value striving and achievement. And for them, an intimate relationship is just another place to strive to get somewhere. But it's like a greyhound who catches the mechanical rabbit. Once they're there, they don't really know what to do with it, and they kind of lose interest lots of times. Now, my schizoid clients, they had early intrusion, neglect, and abuse, a trifecta. And they learned by age 7 that no adult could be trusted really to take care of them. And so they become fiercely independent. They learn to disassociate because during the abuse, they can't really physically leave. They have very rich fantasy lives. As adults, they get very little attention for people who have a personality disorder because they do their work because they don't know they can negotiate differences, so they just do what they're told. As long as they have a corner where people can't intrude on them and they can do their work, they're pretty happy and don't cause trouble. A lot of them never get to therapy despite being profoundly damaged because they find some adaptation that allows them to have human contact while still feeling safe, and they give up on the other two things because it's more important to them.
Sad.
Is that sufficient, or do you want technical definition?
No. I was just saying that's very sad about the schizoid people and how they don't end up in therapy, so they can't get help.
Yeah, but I do get them in therapy, and there's an interesting thing about the schizoid people I get. Before the internet, It gave everybody access to diagnostic manuals. They were the only ones that would correctly diagnose themselves, self-refer to therapy, and come in and tell me what they were. Everyone else who came in with the diagnosis, including people who were previously diagnosed by other therapists with a personality disorder, were mostly wrong. And the schizoids, no, they were correct.
Interesting.
Because one of the things they do is they split their intellect from their emotions and from their body. And they read a lot. Because they're disassociated, they're rather unemotional about making the diagnosis when they make it.
It's an interesting thing because I'm just, running through faces in my mind right now of people I've worked with over the years who have shut down their emotions, but I'm not sure that they are schizoid. I'm wondering how much you can sort of distinguish between somebody who is slightly emotionally shut down and somebody who's schizoid.
Usually the interesting thing is you cannot tell from the outside that somebody is schizoid unless they're so broken that it's obvious. But I can name 2 schizoid movies, if you like, that people have watched. If you ever saw Up in the Air with George Clooney,
yes,
he's playing a schizoid. They never say he is, but if you look at him, he has partial relationships with people as he goes around. His job is to fire people unemotionally for other companies. And he flies and travels all the time. He has no personal life, but he has these brief encounters with people while he's in the air who get to know him at the airport. And he has a sexual relationship with a woman who he only sees on occasion when they're at the same airport. And that is a schizoid adaptation. He will never get to therapy. Well, he might, because at the end of the movie, he actually is not very wise in the ways of relationship, and he's ready to actually try a real relationship with this woman. And he shows up at her door without calling, without any thought that she might have a personal life that he could be intruding on. So it's kind of an interesting movie because whoever wrote it somehow in the depths of them understood that type of life. Woody Allen's movie Zelig, with Mia Farrow playing the psychiatrist, is like a comedy about a schizoid character who changes chameleon-like because he has very porous interpersonal boundaries.
Very interesting. Yeah, that makes me think a lot about people and gives me a different perspective about that. That's really, really interesting. Zelig. So do you think that people who get into relationships and then just become the person that they think the other person wants might have that kind of schizoid adaptation?
Well, some might not. There's a lot of people that come out of a disturbing childhood where they had to pay a lot of attention to what the adults wanted and the adults' moods. They might not have been overtly, really badly abused by this, but people weren't paying normal attention to helping them understand themselves. Usually, the parents are paying attention to the child and start to notice what the child's interests are, and the person develops an identity and is encouraged in their identity to follow their hobbies, to take classes in things that they might like. But a lot of people don't have that ideal situation, and they grow up and they don't know their favorite color. They don't know what they like or don't like. So they often partner up with somebody who is domineering or who has lots of views. And they may not be schizoid, they just have not had a chance to mature and develop that side of themselves. So I wouldn't make the diagnosis from that alone. I had that situation, and I didn't know my favorite color till college when I suddenly discovered that I liked green. And it wasn't even the shade of green that I really like. Now I know it's teal, blue green. But I was in a situation where my intention had to go outward to survive, not inward. And so people who pick somebody, I used to try on people for size and go along with them to what they were interested in. And that way, gradually, I realized, no, I'm not interested in that, or that. It's quite boring. But eventually, I developed myself enough to pick my own interests. So it's not necessarily pathological. It's a delayed maturation in a certain area because of environmental circumstances. Most people with schizoid adaptations are perfectly normal. And when I asked, in fact, their insides do not match their outsides at all. I cannot tell 99% of the time that they're schizoid, whereas I can tell 90% of the time when someone's a narcissist, and about, depending on their level of functioning, pretty much about 70% of the time if they're borderline, because I'm very attracted to warm, high-functioning borderline people. So if I immediately feel comfortable with them, they're probably borderline.
Yeah, I was reading your bio and it was saying how you had encountered some people like that in your early life and they were pleasant. So you have a more positive feeling toward people with these kinds of personalities now that you're a therapist.
Yes, I was fortunate in that both sides of my family had crazy people. And they were not, for the main, they were nice crazy people. They weren't dangerous crazy. I had one uncle and a stepfather who were cold narcissists, and they gave me a clue as to what the abuse, really, the people who've been on the receiving end of a lot of nastiness, because the ones in my family were completely neurotic and had multiple things, but they were generous, warm, and friendly. So I just had to keep them in their good place. And so as a little kid, I learned to strategize how to get somebody out of a depression or an anxiety state so they would come play with me. And I used to practice on my aunts and uncles.
Good practice for later life.
Yeah. So by the time I was an adult, I was kind of surprised when I started studying borderline in, say, the late 70s. People were telling me it was pointless, it was useless, these people aren't nice. And, that just wasn't my experience. There are people who aren't nice and there are people who are nice. And there's things you have to be careful with everybody who has a personality disorder. But personality disorders aren't things you're born with, the kind that I treat. They're things that is a combination of your own personal temperament, your environment, and then the larger culture around you, and some fate, some things that impact your family that nobody chose, like being in a war zone, or somebody having postpartum depression, your mother after you're born. And so it's an add-on. People already have a predisposition towards a certain personality, and then in early childhood, they get the beginnings of the personality disorder as they try and adapt as best they can to maximize the amount of love, approval, and attention they get. And so in a family that breeds narcissists, you usually do not get love. You get attention for achievements or for supporting the head narcissist. So little kids start to pick these. That's the reason I call them adaptations, not disorders, in my book, because we adapt as best we can to our environment. And some people do not have the temperament to become a narcissist. They're just too egalitarian and empathic. Narcissists, people with narcissistic personality disorder, they lack almost all emotional empathy. And my best guess is that certain families do not breed for empathy in the same way some families don't have a lot of athletic or musical talent, that it's on a continuum. And if temperamentally and genetically you're not predisposed to high empathy, and then you're in an environment that supports low emotional empathy and does not reward empathy at all, only rewards achievement or obedience, you're not going to really develop empathy. Empathy also is developed on the playground, too. It's by the parents or the caretakers, where they point out, Billy, you wouldn't like it if Johnny took your ball. How would you feel then? You see? And a lot of this is taught, but if it's not taught, and you don't have it to begin with very high, you could become a narcissist in reaction to certain environments where someone else in that environment would become schizoid. It's kind of interesting. And whereas I have people born into narcissistic families who made a borderline adaptation because they abandoned.
So tell me a little bit more about this borderline adaptation, because I see a lot of patients who have varying degrees of these borderline traits. And I've always wondered, there's a little bit of controversy, what goes into creating somebody with these kinds of traits. What do you think? What's your perspective on it?
Well, usually it's repeated abandonment, emotional or physical. And that there's also often abuse. Now, I have seen clients with perfectly nice parents who appear to have gotten borderline adaptations without abuse, but we never know what goes on inside and what different people, what's abused to one kid could be overlooked by somebody with a thicker skin with a different temperamental. But most of my clients had enough abandonment and abuse that it was perfectly obvious why they became borderline. Sometimes I do a check. Some people have brought their mother or father to therapy for one day so I can meet them. And they were just as they were described, which is kind of interesting that most people, are quite accurate, really. When I do meet the parent, it's not very different than the way that the client described them.
It's a pretty good thing for them, I guess, because they're, in touch with reality.
Yeah, they may have. Now, I do believe that right now the groupings we have, these are not set in stone, borderline, narcissist, schizoid. I think we're going to find that some of the people in these groups, that the groups have subgroups. Like when I see someone who's profoundly schizoid, who spends most of their time in fantasy, gets anxiety, has social anxiety severely on top of it, and dreads every minute of the day going forward because they can't control it. And I compare them to my schizoid clients who underwent abuse, but who were functioning better and can fit into the everyday world. I think it's really two different disorders. I think they look superficially similar, but the more severe one, I think, probably has a genetic component because their background, yes, they were treated like a doll. Most of the schizoid clients I have weren't treated like humans. They weren't treated like people with feelings. They were treated like objects who were either pleasing objects, and you could use them like one client described himself, I'm like the vacuum cleaner that gets taken out of the closet when my mother needs me. And the rest of the time, I should just go back in the closet. Or other clients had the doors taken off their room so that they didn't have any privacy, even in the bathroom. That's really intrusive. You can understand why they might make an independent adaptation where it's only safe to be. But a client like the ones I have that are at an unbearable end of the schizoid spectrum. The one client wanted to live in the 1800s, and in her brain, she constructed a whole world that was just in the 1800s. And when I asked about it, she said, I can control everything there. It's the way I want it. I hate every moment of daily life because it's new. It's uncontrollable. It's unexpected. I could be caught off guard. Now, that's pretty extreme.
Yeah, that's very extreme. You were saying earlier in our conversation that there's a lot of narcissism in our sort of public world today. What do you think is going on with the personality disorders, in the more public and political sphere?
Well, I think what happened was when I started practice, everybody was being diagnosed as borderline, even if they weren't, who had a personality disorder. And I think that there's a combination going on now. Each decade or couple of decades, there's sort of a zeitgeist of the era. I was a hippie in the late 60s, and it was very hard to tell a borderline person then from a hippie, say, because the ethos of the group was spontaneity, sex with whoever you wanted. There was drug use. Impulsiveness was not seen as a negative. And so against that background, it was very hard to see who was really disturbed. It's like you can't see who's naked till the tide goes out. But when we hit the 70s, the ethos changed around 1972 to this, young, upwardly mobile professionals striving for objects. And cocaine became the drug of choice, not psychedelics or methamphetamine. And those were altered the personality and shut down empathy and enlarged the sense of I am special, what those drugs did. So but however, at that period of time, we're now in the schizoid era, I actually think. There's a lag before the public catches up with what's actually going on. And in that era, borderlines were perfectly visible because they were still doing things impulsively. They were still having sex with inappropriate people. And the rest of the world had moved on and was achieving. So in that era, narcissists, it was hard to tell the narcissists from the non-narcissists because we all had situational narcissism, except for the people who went to live on a farm in Vermont. And situational narcissism is humans are adaptable. Women adapt to the latest fashions. I swore in the 80s when the big shoulder pads came in, I don't think you're old enough to remember them, that they would never look right to me. This was a crazy proportion for women, but by the end of the time, I was wearing them and they looked perfectly lovely. So humans are adaptable, and if there's a situation, an era that we're in that rewards certain values, we're likely to adopt them the same way we adopt hemlines. Now, there'll always be people who are late adopters, early adopters. So right now, the narcissism that we're seeing is starker because we're actually in a schizoid era where we're separate from other people. You and I are doing this interview on the internet through Zoom. We're not face-to-face. That's wonderful for schizoids. I have perfect safety from you. Either of us can detach from what's going on. And this is a podcast, so it's even further schizoid. It's another step removed from the lively interpersonal exchange that happens spontaneously between two people because it can be edited. You see what I mean? So we're in schizoid time. So the narcissists now are naked. And we can see them more clearly. And because of the wonderful people who have in Silicon Valley who have given us these tools, we can look up things. We can share other people's experience. I write for Quora. I'm on Psychology Today. I have a blog, Understanding Narcissism. People, strangers who I've never met, now I don't get people by referral so much as people find me. They Google narcissism, they Google their problem, they come up with my name, and I get an email or a phone call. So people are becoming very, very aware of it. Now politicians have always been narcissistic. Anyone who thinks that they have a better way of running the country or the world is either wonderful and actually is a genius and has come up with a better way, or they're likely to be a bit narcissistic and love power and want to be at the top of the food chain at that. And in any case, now people are looking at that more critically. And in looking at our public figures with that eye, we're also looking at our mates and our friends. And it has become, here's part of my mission, is to not get everybody called a narcissist just because you don't like their behavior or just because they're self-centered. And I will tell you where the dividing line between the personality disorder traits is for me, if you're interested.
Absolutely.
This was my early mission. I said I would study with whomever could explain this to me in a way that satisfied me. I didn't know the difference between, I was seeing people with certain kinds of traits in therapy, and then I was hearing about personality disorders. And I said, well, where is the dividing line? How do I know? And the object relations theorist, and particularly James Masterson, was my favorite of them, had the answer, actually. Now, you'll have to excuse this language. It's a terrible name, object relations. We're really talking about people, internalized images of people. But they're only objects in the sense that if you imagine each of us has an internal dollhouse of the world, okay? Mm-hmm. It exists in us, and we fill the rooms with our images and impressions of the people in our life. Okay, so it's not the real people. Now, the answer that I got to my question, which I will explain, but first I'll give it in jargon, okay, was if someone had whole object relations and object constancy, they could not qualify for a diagnosis of personality disorder. They might have traits, they might be unpleasant, you might hate them, they might hate you, but they don't have a personality disorder. So what does that mean? Whole object relations is the capacity to see oneself and other people as a mixed bag, as having both good and bad qualities simultaneously, liked and disliked. If you don't have whole object relations, you're split. You see things as all good or all bad, which explained those early clients of mine who 1 week they loved me, and the next week I said something that they didn't like, and I was all bad, and they were quitting therapy. So they didn't have whole object relations. They could not form an integrated, realistic, stable, or relatively stable picture of me. So when I was being nice to them in their mind, I was doing something they liked. They saw me as all good, wonderful, special, unique, depending on which disorder they had. And when I was doing something that annoyed them, disappointed them, hurt their feelings, frustrated them, felt like a punishment, they were angry with me, they saw me as all bad. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That black and white kind of thinking, right, that we talk about when we're looking through the diagnostic criteria for these disorders.
And the best predictor of abuse for me is a narcissist with a lack of object constancy. It could be a borderline, but in general, it will be someone with narcissistic personality disorder, their lack of object constancy. Why am I saying this? You know, all those stories that we used to hear about this man kills his wife and then he cries afterwards saying that she was his love of the life and he's so sorry he never meant to harm her. Okay? He killed her in the middle of a fight. Now, what happened here? Do we believe him? I believe him in most of the cases. I believe he doesn't have whole object relations. He lacks object constancy. What's that? Object constancy is the ability to remember our positive history with someone and how much we like them while we're angry with them. Now, in a fight, this is really important because love turns to hatred in a second in the middle of a fight, and the person becomes your enemy, and everything good they did is forgotten if you don't have object constancy. Okay? So that's when you're likely to hit somebody or say things that go below the belt. And if you have object constancy, you can remember, I still want a relationship with this person. There's things about them that I value and like. So you think something, but you might not say it. And you certainly aren't going to beat them up because you value them unharmed and alive because you love them. Now, with the narcissist, you have another complicator with narcissistic personality disorder. I'm using, by the way, in my mind, these are not names for people. These are names for patterns of behavior and thinking. So when I say narcissist, it's a shorthand way of talking about someone who has adopted a pattern of being in the world and thinking about other people and themselves. That pattern is what we call the narcissistic pattern, the narcissistic personality disorder. A borderline woman in my therapy said she hated being borderline and had such stigma. She hated to think of herself that way. And I said, that's easy. I know how to fix that. And she said, well, what do I do? I said, well, you just stop acting borderline and find new coping skills. I'll help you. And she smiled. She actually got it, that it was her coping skills that were borderline, and that if she didn't want to be borderline, she could learn these new coping skills that were non-borderline ways of coping with her problems and her emotions. Does this make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's really, really interesting. And I'm just like flipping through my patients and thinking about this one and that one and in a different light. So it's fun. It's fun to get a little bit of this perspective. Another question I wanted to ask you is, you know, a lot of times people get involved with somebody who's an abusive narcissist. And not only do they get involved with this person, they stick around even when the person is being abusive. And even when they break up, they might then go and find another person like that. What is it in somebody that makes them constantly attracted to an abusive narcissist and tolerant of their bad behavior?
Usually it's their early childhood. Most people are trying to get a do-over, a repair of the parts of the things that they think go well during childhood. So unconsciously, many people, for example, I spoke with someone yesterday who described herself as trauma bonded. I've written articles on that for my Psychology Today, Understanding Narcissism, if anybody wants to read about trauma bonding, and poor Patty Hearst and the Stockholm Syndrome. And she described herself as trauma bonded. So I said to this guy, and she didn't know why. She could describe him perfectly. And when she talked about him, it was I said, well, what is it that you're looking for from him? And she talked about wanting approval and love and all these things. And I said, who early in your life did you want them from? What was your father like? And her father, I didn't know this woman, it was my first meeting, was a narcissist. And she couldn't get this from him. And I said, well, I'll give you a tip to get out of being trauma bonded to your husband. And she said, what is it? I said, whenever you tell yourself, oh, I want your love, add the word daddy instead of his name. And it clicked in her head. So really, Harville Hendricks talks about this in his Imago relationship therapy in a more positive vein. And he says that we choose people to be each other's therapists so we can repair their bad childhood. We don't know we're doing this. And the problem is we don't know how to do a repair, and they don't know how to do a repair because we've chosen too well. And does that?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So these people who are sticking around because they're still hoping that they're going to be able to fix something from the past in the present.
Yes, and also sometimes you see relatively normal people who end up trauma bonded. And, I say relatively normal because we all, nobody had a perfect childhood. Very few. Look what happened to poor Patty Hearst. She was kidnapped, tortured, raped, brainwashed, and then became Tanya, accepted her, the Symbionese Army, I think it was called, the group that did this to her. And she went to jail, and I don't think she should have. I think that she was, any more than a Korean War veteran should be sent to jail because he got brainwashed, by the war and what happened to him, and he was captured. So we have done studies with mice that actually, with rats, with Norwegian lab rats, that actually shed light on this. Well, one of the first things you're taught in an undergrad experimental program, like I went through at Columbia University when I was getting my bachelor's in psych, is you're given a lab rat of your very own, and you're told how to teach it to press a lever to get a pellet. And we're taught this to illustrate reinforcement schedules and what works and what doesn't work, and also how to shape a behavior, which comes in handy later on for psychologists. And it seems like a lot of work has been done to see, using rats as a model, because they react very similar to human beings, believe it or not, which is why we use them. But they're more plentiful, and so far there aren't too many animal rights laws against this. There should be a few, I think. And if you reward a rat every time they press the lever with a pellet of delicious food, and you stop rewarding it, the question is, how do we get the rat to keep on pressing the lever forever without getting any reinforcement? Okay, that's the ideal question. And that's the equivalent of living with a narcissist after all the good stuff has gone down the tubes. Why is the person still there? The rat's still pressing the lever in the hopes of reinforcement. Well, how did they get trained to do that? They were put on a schedule of intermittent reinforcement. We found that if a rat knows every 2 hours you get a pellet, it's not going to press the lever in between. It gets on to 2 hours. Rats can tell time as well internally somewhat. They'll start pressing the lever. And then if they don't get any pellets, they'll wait another 2 hours. They'll try a few hours down, and then they'll stop pressing forever. Occasionally, maybe once in a blue moon, they might go back if they're left in the room with the lever just to try it. They found, however, if the rats could not predict when they would get reinforced and get this delicious pellet, then they would keep pressing, and it was very hard to extinguish that response. They were, in essence, they had, in essence, accepted the intermittent reinforcement as the way life is. And they were going to stay near that lever so that they could be there when the pellet appeared. Now, when we find a new mate and everything is lovey-dovey, we're getting the pellet. In the beginning of each relationship, whether the person's a narcissist or not, we get a lot of pellets of love. And with the narcissist, those pellets start to decrease as they get to know you, as they get to feel certain of you. And then you start to be devalued. So not only aren't you getting pellets, but you're getting smacked around verbally or physically at some point and made to feel awful. But then again comes another pellet of reinforcement. So after a bit, the ratio of good reinforcements to bad things, the good diminishes, the bad increases. But by that time, the person has the memory of all those early good love pellets, and they want to get them back. And they don't know because they can't predict the narcissist pattern until they've learned it. Once you learn it, it's really, really predictable, but not always avoidable, but predictable. They stick around because inside them, they still want the love they got initially. Now, the love initially that we get in a relationship is usually replaced by a softer type of love, not the wild, passionate one for most people. And as the wild passion diminishes, intimacy increases, and familiarity breeds comfort for the average person. It's not like that for the narcissist. Familiarity breeds contempt. And once the heightened love state is gone for the narcissist, they blame it on you. It's your fault it's gone. If you need to change. So while you're getting more comfortable in the relationship and okay with the wild passion, as long as you're with this person and get comfortable, they're having the opposite reaction. For them, somehow you've taken away all the goodies. And that's why many narcissists portray themselves as the victim, because they blame the other person for the state of the relationship. By the way, narcissism can be viewed as a self-esteem regulation disorder, where the person needs other people to validate them, or they start to sink into self-hating depressions. So it's like having a leaky gas tank in your car. You have to fill up the car much more often, and you're much more afraid of other people taking your gas. And it's like the gas stations are all going to close by 6, and my car is leaking gas. And that's how narcissists live. They live where they need another fix and another fix. It's like being an addict from other people.
Yeah, I've definitely witnessed that in my practice. Now, earlier, before we started recording, you were talking about a treatment that you're developing for some personality issues, and it sounded intriguing because it also is about ruthless compassion, which is my cool, idea in my head about how to deal with people, and not just people with disorders or adaptations, but, everybody in the world. To me, ruthless compassion is kind of the way to go. And so when you talked to me about your thoughts about ruthless compassion, I thought, we have to discuss this on the podcast. So how do you use ruthless compassion in your treatment of people with these adaptations?
Well, I have started to develop a short-term treatment. There is none for narcissistic personality disorder, and it's only short-term relatively. I went back. I've been in practice since March 1974, so I have a lot of experience. And I've been teaching personality disorders to people since the 80s, and more in the 90s after I went through the Masterson Institute and learned a bit more And so I've had a long time to see why the therapy of narcissistic personality disorder is so long. We're talking about a minimum 3 years for partial fix to usually more like 10 years. Very few people, and there aren't very many people trained because the training is as long as the therapy. It's a very difficult training to train how to treat personality disorders, especially to learn all three major ones the way I wanted. So when I went to look back over the narcissists, most of the people who came to me who stayed, only about 1 in 20 exhibitionist narcissists actually stay in therapy, in my mind. That's a loose number. I didn't count, but so many of them do not. And the ones that stay often lengthen their own therapy enormously by insisting on talking about blaming other people for their problems, offloading everything, the responsibility for everything that goes wrong. They tell repetitious stories. If you have a narcissistic aunt or uncle, they have 6 stories and they tell them over and over at every occasion. And this happens in therapy too. Or they want to tell me what's wrong with me as a therapist. Since I'm not the reason they came to therapy, I think it's a waste of their time. So I came up with 3 things, and only through things the ruthless compassion therapy of narcissism will have in it. Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Then I call it brutal therapy because it is for the narcissist a bit brutal. I take away all the different time-wasting defenses. You're only allowed to talk about 3 things, and that's where my compassion will go. When you're talking about these 3 things, I will be very compassionate. You can only talk about your own pain, about that you need to heal from your childhood in the past, that's 1, or pain now, your pain, not other people's problems or what you don't like about them. And we can work on healing your past pain and situation. You can talk about in therapy what you want to grow more of for yourself, what you'd like to be better at as a human being, what you want to work on to change about yourself in a positive direction to get more of, like more empathy or to get object relations. I teach how to get whole object relations. You can learn it after childhood. It's like you learning to whistle or something like that. It might be harder for some people, but anybody can learn it. And the third thing they're allowed to talk about is what they want to do less of. Like I want to stop raging at my wife when she annoys me. I want to stop being take it so personally what my husband says when he points out that I've done something less than optimally. So those are the 3 things. And if you go off any of those things, to blame me, to blame the people in your life, to tell me a pointless story that's very tangential, or to complain about circumstances, or to talk about my office or something irrelevant to your therapy, we're going right back to one of those 3. And
I love it.
And that takes care of all the blaming of other people that can waste a huge amount of time.
Now, how much do they tolerate this, though?
Well, I haven't had anybody do a full therapy tolerating it. Usually they quit at some point. I've been polishing it in the last year. I had been starting to do it intuitively. It's not so different than Otto Kernberg's object relations. He was much more confrontive directly than Masterson, but he does it I don't get that he's compassionate while he's doing it.
Mm-hmm.
He's really a tough bird, and he will challenge every narcissistic defense. I'm not challenging the defense quite like that and pointing out it's narcissistic. I'm just saying we need to go back to you talking about you and your issues and what you want to heal or change about yourself. And that's going to be my answer to corral them. And I think I'm probably going to write a paper on that I write papers. I'm an associate editor for Gestalt Review, and I have an article in the current Gestalt review on group therapy, how to do group therapy with people with personality adaptations, borderline narcissistic and schizoid. That's available in libraries through, is it JSTOR? Is what it's called when peer-reviewed journals are available. But I'd like to write it up, and I'd like to, I'm letting all narcissists know who come to me for therapy now that that's how I'm working. So they can choose in the beginning, they have a choice. Would you like a super long, expensive therapy that will be more pleasant for you, but may not ever end? You may not ever get to where you want to go, and in the process, you may lose your friends and mates who are really pissed off at you, excuse the language, and you may lose your therapist because it's a very, very long therapy, and usually you're going to be unpleasant to me at many points. Or would you like a short, much more economical therapy where you're pretty sure to get out of here in 3 years, much happier and much better adapted to modern life and less worried about your self-esteem than when you came? That'll be their choice. I'm not going to do the long one anymore, and I'll refer them out to one of my colleagues who has 10 years to spare and doesn't mind a year of simply empathizing. That must have been so painful for you when your wife had a baby and kept you up all night with her screams while she was in labor.
Right. You know, I gleaned from something you said, something that I relate to as well, which is that when we are being a psychotherapist and doing our best to be empathetic, we're also sometimes tolerating, a certain amount of abuse ourselves. And if we tolerate too much abuse, it can be very tiring and draining and make it less pleasant for us to continue being a therapist. And therefore, everybody loses, because if we get burnt out because we're taking in too much, bad behavior, then we're not going to be able to help anyone else. So I think having that ruthless compassion, certainly for myself in my practice and in my life, and developing this wonderful new tool, I think it's also going to save a lot of therapists, because we're going to tolerate a lot less mistreatment, and therefore we'll have more energy and more optimism and more positive energy to bring to our therapy practice and be able to help more people.
Yes, I want more people to train in personality disorders, but I don't want them to have to do. I did 15 years of training. At my own expense, and I was already certified. I'm certified in 4 types of therapy. So they were all at my own expense, and most therapists aren't as crazy and as driven as I am to get to the bottom of things. So I thought this will make it very easy to teach therapists how to deal with this, because I can explain narcissism in a few sessions. I can practice with them and then have them cut me off and change the topic back every time I go off if I role play the narcissistic client. Now, some people will stick with it, and other people, so it'll be easier for the therapist to learn this because it's a fairly simple therapy then. They just have to learn to recognize when the person is not actually working on their problems. And I train therapists in Europe. I go to a different country every year. In June, I will be in Bratislava. The Dusan, I think his last name's Gabor. And last year it was Norway. I did two years in Poland. And I did Toronto in Poland, I think, in the same thing. So I find that people are very interested, but they can't get training locally other than through books. And so I'm looking for shorter ways to train therapists as well, so we can get more people, because people contact me for long distance therapy because they're in a country and there's no therapists there who know how to do this.
Yeah, it's a real issue, I think, and I think that it will be wonderful when you can educate more people so that they can take that message and spread it around and help more people in a simpler way that's better for them as therapists and better for the people on the receiving end of the treatment.
Yes, and well, do you have other questions?
I was just going to ask you, what are you up to these days? But I think you've already answered it in terms of this.
Well, I have a couple of things I'm up to.
Okay.
I had done an article I was contacted by Die Zeit, which is a German weekly newspaper, by a reporter who wanted to do a feature article on me for their magazine section. And I don't speak German, but I've been told by people who do that is a very big deal in Germany, Die Zeit. And it's the most popular German weekly newspaper, and it's some combination of Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Or so I was told by my German neighbor who was so excited to see me. He was reading his Die Zeit in August and there. And through that article, which took about 3 months to do properly to get it done, I was contacted by German publishers who wanted to publish my book. My book is Borderline Narcissistic and Schizoid Adaptations, The Pursuit of Love, Admiration, and Safety. That first question I asked you. Mm-hmm. And it's available on Amazon. And I self-published it because I knew the publishing industry quite well, actually. I had friends in publishing, and I knew I'd have to write a proposal, and they wouldn't like my book because it was quirky, and they would want changes. So I wanted to be exactly as I wanted it. I wanted to communicate what I wanted to communicate the way I wanted to do it. And that says a lot about my personality, actually. And after Die Zeit, the German publishers contacted me. A good friend of mine from here, Marion Heidel, was in the book business, and she connected me through a friend of hers to a German agent, Agency Hoffman, and they are representing me, and my book will be published in hardcover in Germany in 18 months. I just signed the contract, so that's in the works. I have 2 books that I'm simultaneously writing. The articles that will become chapters in them are currently posted to my blog on psychologytoday.com, Understanding Narcissism. So if you Google my name, Understanding Narcissism, Psychology Today, you'll get the blog. And there is no self-help book for narcissists. Can you believe that? There's a self-help guide for everybody but narcissists. So I'm writing one. And what I'm doing is I'm actually writing how-to articles, step by step, how to get whole object relations, how to get object constancy, how to control narcissistic rage, how to control the evaluation of other people and why you should. And I have most people will not be reading this who are narcissists because they don't even want to admit they're narcissists because it's a narcissistic injury to their self-esteem to admit they have any flaws. But there is a subgroup of self-aware narcissists. What I mean self-aware is they still have narcissistic personality disorder, but they've been made aware of it and they accept that that's true. And they need a book. Now, I know that it's more likely to become the holiday book for the relatives of narcissists and mates of narcissists to give to the narcissist. But if 1% of the narcissists read it, I will be happy. So I'm writing that. This will be a book of exercises for people to do to get the different capacities back, including to increase their empathy or how to sufficiently use their cognitive empathy to compensate for lacking emotional empathy. So that's it. I'm very excited about that, and I don't have a publisher for it yet. Someone reached out to me, but they quite weren't the right one. And I'm hoping perhaps through the German publisher doing that I will find someone that I think would like my work in that. And the other book is provisional title, The Survival Guide to Living with a Narcissist. And I want to have on the cover of that a representation that will get the picture across. So there's going to be a wreath or something over a doorway in which red roses are intertwined with barbed wire. And that says a lot what it's like when you love a narcissist. It's red roses and barbed wire.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So those are my 2 projects in the wings, plus my training, plus your podcast is now added to that. My mission is I see both the people who consider themselves victims of narcissistic abuse. My group therapy group, half of it is filled with people who are working on either how do I live with the narcissist in my life or how do I live with live without the narcissist in my life, or how do I get rid of the narcissist in my life? There is one fun thing that I learned that you might find interesting, your listeners, if you have time. I discovered early on, when you were talking about why don't people leave, not everybody is confident, independent, and brave. So I saw a number of women who have what I term the widow fantasy. Have you heard about this?
No.
The widow fantasy, this woman, the first woman who told me about it, I gave it the name because of her. She was a very sweet lady, and she actually had a very unusual talent, which was she could go to art galleries, and if she was aesthetically moved by the painting, she could have an orgasm.
Wow.
I thought it was fascinating. I want to share her talent. I have to be very careful what I looked at while I was working. But having said that, she was married to a man who was very forceful, very domineering. She was frightened of him. She was a very kind of submissive woman, very nice. With the right man, she would have had a happy marriage, but he was not the right man. However, she didn't wish anyone ill. She didn't feel strong enough to leave, but he traveled for work, and she used to fantasize that his plane would go down and he would die. And it wouldn't be her fault. She wouldn't have to do anything bad to him. She wouldn't have to leave. She wouldn't have to go through a divorce. She wouldn't have to tell the children, that things were wrong with their father. And then the next part of her fantasy involved her at the gravesite, dressed in black with a long black veil, like a Johnny Cash song, weeping while people comfort her. And then she gets all the money and doesn't have to worry about her husband again. And she's a very sympathetic figure instead of being the monster who left this man.
Wow. That's an interesting fantasy.
However, since then, I have had at least a dozen women tell me that fantasy.
It's like they don't want to take responsibility for not liking somebody and abandoning this narcissist. They have this, they sort of made this toxic narcissist into this poor little boy, and they feel sorry for him, and they don't want to hurt him.
Well, some of them it's that, and the others are afraid. I learned to drive as an adult, so I'm not an experienced driver, and I'm afraid on a throughway, for example. I try and avoid them. So there are people who are afraid they've been with the person so long that they've lost touch with how to drive their own life, how to do the scary things, how to even, whatever, let alone get a divorce from someone. So it's not that they feel bad for the boy, is they want to see themselves as good people, but they feel inadequate to do what is necessary. It feels exhausting. Divorces are exhausting, and narcissists retaliate. They are not easy people to divorce if they're not the ones instigating the divorce. So even if they hate the guy, I have some people that really are indifferent or hate it. One woman she was a narcissist, married to a narcissist. She said, I love my lifestyle. I just don't want my husband in it. Right. So I'd like him to leave me with the lifestyle, pay for it all, and then just go.
Interesting people.
Yeah, so that's very common. I hear this a lot. I love if the woman's at all narcissistic herself and can be just as cold, then it's, let's just get rid of him.
There are a lot of women I can just think of right now in the public eye, but I will not get into that right now because I think we need to start to wind up this conversation. I just wanted to ask you at the end if you have a call to action for the listeners apropos of our conversation today.
Well, the call to action for me is to know yourself, to know what you want, and to size yourself up accurately and go after what you want. And the thing that I started with is a good place to start. Do you want love? Do you want admiration? Do you want interpersonal safety? If you don't know what you want, you're likely to end up with the wrong thing or project that need onto people. Then you have to look clearly for what you want, whether they actually have it. Not that you wish they'd have it, not that they say they have it, but do they demonstrate to you that they have it and that they will give it to you? And if they don't, if they're ambivalent, if the evidence that you see doesn't fit into what you want, you have to have ruthless compassion for yourself and not go there with them. Choose someone else.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great call to action for the listeners. Well, listen, I really want to thank you for coming on to the podcast to talk about your thoughts today, because it's really interesting, all the things you're talking about. And I particularly enjoyed hearing about your new ruthless compassion approach to treating narcissists. And I think I'm going to really look out for that article, because I think I want to share it with a lot of people. I think it's really good.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
That was the brilliant Dr. Elinor Greenberg, and I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. If you like this podcast, please review it on iTunes, and you can sign up for my free monthly wellness newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll also learn about my new online courses. Life can be challenging. It's a lot easier, though, when we're connected to a strong community of people who share our vision, but who also challenge our assumptions. Our community at the Ruthless Compassion Institute embraces concepts such as empathy, honesty, empowerment, and personal responsibility. We're glad you spent some time with us today, and we hope you join the Ruthless Compassion community and keep on listening to the amazing stories our members have to tell.